Yeah, thanks.
I've met
Princess Michael, or Prince Michael. Have you?
I've met the guy who played Raven.
This is my way to go around the table.
No. I'm too young. Thanks, Charlotte. Oh, I thought you said I was too young. No. No, Aline likes Charlie and Lola. She's at that kind of age. It's great. It is actually quite funny. I quite enjoy Charlie and Lola. Do you have a television? No. You're too busy writing essays and just too busy generally.
He didn't have a telly last year, and now he has it. It's really exciting, but he doesn't want it so much that he actually stuck it in my room.
Right, let's get started. So if we can just remind ourselves of what we... Hello.
Hi.
Pair of binoculars. If we can just remind ourselves of what we looked at for Sarah's benefit. Welcome, Sarah. Well, I don't think it deserves a round of applause, but there we are. So we're looking at so far we've looked at the effect of unemployment, and we've come up with a few points. One point being that unemployment degrades to such an extent that these men will do anything to escape the effects, the boredom, the cold, the hunger, and so on and so forth. The idea that in order to create you need to have peace of mind, and that the men who have any talent, any writing talent, can't write because they're unable to actually find that peace of mind. Then the last thing we talked about was at the bottom of page 76. We mentioned the idea of bread and circuses, that this Marxist perspective that in order for people to control people, Marx talked about the way in which people could be controlled through by feeding them and by keeping them entertained. A lot of people believe nowadays that that's still a very relevant point, that for a lot of people live in fairly poor circumstances, certainly not as poor as this, but because they have junk food and X Factor, they're happy. And this is a kind of the idea of looking at a Marxist perspective on contemporary society, that we will never have a rebellion in this country because people have McDonald's and X Factor. I don't know what you think about that.
That's why the riots happen in the summer holidays. People didn't have anything to do.
That was one of the comments that came out of the end of the riots, the summer before last. That riot would not have happened out of the summer holidays. The reason it happened in the summer holidays is because a lot of teenagers were bored.
Plus,
I don't.
There's a correlation between heat and riots
Mm-hmm.
as well.
Yeah, but to be honest, when like kids and youths and that, when they find out a little bit about the government, they think they know it all and they're going to do something, take a stand. It's like, no, you're making yourself look like an idiot.
They're not even doing anything and taking. They're not even taking a stand. It wasn't even.
No, they're nicking stuff. They're nicking stuff.
It's a man with Tesco value, Basmati rice. Yes,
Oh yeah.
I only got arrested.
Yeah.
I love that photo. It's my favourite photo ever. One of the two people like
I don't know if this is true, but I've heard the only store that wasn't affected in London riots was Waterstones.
Because no one wanted to steal books. That's hilarious, isn't it? I hadn't heard that. That's brilliant.
It was the most hilarious thing.
In a rebellion, your bookshops are safe, which is bizarre because actually here he seems to be saying the opposite, that actually it's people reading. And certainly the reason that there were so many revolutions, the reason that revolutions happened when they did was post people being able to read and having access to books. That really prior to the Renaissance there weren't really those sorts of rebellions, that it was actually in the 17th and 18th centuries particularly where these rebellions occurred, because people had access to stuff to read in order to understand and therefore to rebel because they understood.
But also then, like, I don't know if that's something I wasn't there, but I don't know, there's a different sort of mentality, because then it was like probably a really, really good thing to be educated, and now it's still a good thing to be educated, but like a lot of teenagers like kind of think it's more uncool, whereas then it may have been the opposite. So sort of being able to read and be like, it's very
Absolutely, education was everything.
I was going to say, because like hardly any people actually had access to it.
Yeah.
And that was really like, it's like even in like the 50s and 60s, the only way you So like everything seems to already pass through and everyone passes it on.
It's very Handmaid's Tale, like, you know how they talk about books and like,
Yeah.
education and like the power of reading.
Yeah, absolutely.
People to want to change things and like that.
If you look at the Nazi book, I mean, it came out of the Nazi book burnings in the Second World War, that the Nazis burned so many books because he saw that subversive thinking was what he had to ban, and therefore the books were burned. But if you look at the printing press, it was late 15th century, wasn't it? Was Claxton's printing press. And if you look at all the rebellions, you've got the Protestant rebellion in the 17th century in this country. You've got the French Revolution. You've got the American War of Independence. You've got all of these different wars and revolutions. All of them came after people could learn to read. All of them came at that point. All these rebellions against the government, against the state, all came after the printing press, because people had access. Once people could read, and once people could pass books to one another, you know, kind of illegally pass books that were banned, the word began to be shared. And as soon as you've got lots of people sharing the same ideas, that's when revolutions occur. What Marx seemed to suggest is, providing you keep people fed and entertained, then they're not going to rebel because they've got no reason. It's like Maslow's hierarchy. If you're hungry, you will rebel. Providing you're not hungry, then you've got nothing to rebel against, because you know you've got some entertainment and you've got bread in your stomach. It's quite an interesting idea, and it's one of the things about Marx that still survives to the day. Did anyone have anything else? Any other points on that first passage? Did anyone see it? Have any comments about this national unemployed workers movement?
They said that gave them legal advice against the means test.
Against the government, the government were the ones giving the means test.
What was
The means test was a means test is a way of determining how much money you're going to get from the government. So for example, they might see if you have any savings, if you have anyone else in your family that might be working, how many people are in your family, where you live in the country, and they would determine how much money that you would need in order to survive. And of course, it was all there was a way of them trimming it. So actually, what they gave was virtually nothing. Okay, I tell you what. Let's have a look. Can you turn to page 79? Because what I'd like to do is just to look at the last few pages of chapter 5, and then we'll move on to look at chapter 7. When 250,000 miners are unemployed. So it's literally a page after the one that you were just looking at. I've just skipped a couple of paragraphs. Where did we get to in your copy?
71. No, 71.
Right, so it's... Okay, let's read it through. And this time you're focusing on again the idea of the effect of unemployment, but interestingly, towards the end of this passage, the idea of the circuses, the frivolities, the luxuries that people have, even though they have no money. And I think this is really interesting. And I think it's very relevant even today, that what Orwell talks about at the end of chapter 5 is just as relevant in today's society. When 250,000 miners are unemployed, it is part of the order of things that Alf Smith, a miner living in the back streets of Newcastle, should be out of work. Alf Smith is merely one of the 250,000, a statistical unit. But no human being finds it easy to regard himself as a statistical unit. I've never been able to say that word. So long as Bert Jones crosses the street and is still at work, Alf Smith is bound to feel himself dishonoured and a failure. Hence that frightful feeling of impotence and despair, which is almost the worst evil of unemployment. Far worse than any hardship, worse than the demoralisation of enforced idleness, and only less bad than the physical degeneracy of Alf Smith's children, born on the PAC. Everyone who saw Greenwood's play Love and the Doll must remember that dreadful moment when the poor, good, stupid working man beats on the table and cries out, "Oh God, send me some work." This was not dramatic exaggeration, it was a touch from life. That cry must have been uttered in almost those words in tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, of English homes during the past 15 years. So what's the main point he's making in this paragraph about unemployment?
Like the feeling of it working, that's like the image, like the fact that you do feel so worthless.
Yeah.
Actually worse than being hungry or like.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's also interesting when he says that no human being finds it easy to regard himself as this physical unit. It's kind of like the acceptance of the degrading that you subject yourself to, like one of these like things that we talked about earlier, and as well like the feeling of being, I guess, irrelevant.
Yeah,
They use
absolutely.
the feeling of impotence and despair.
Yeah.
And I just think that's like really not useful in any way.
Yeah.
Not having contribution.
Yeah, good. And that's what it boils down to. It boils down to these men having no use in their life, and to have no use means that you just have complete despair. So it's less about the fact your children are malnourished, and it's actually more about the fact that you have no purpose. It's this purposelessness that he keeps coming back to time and again.
And so they still have like that small amount of pride that means that they can't, but they still feel the pain of degrading themselves.
Yeah.
It's not like they're kind of like pack animals. They're still human beings, and so and they still have that small amount of pride that, oh, that man over there can provide for his family, but I can't.
Yeah.
And so it's like this psychological trauma.
It's interesting that he talks at the beginning here. It's part of the order of things when 250,000 are unemployed, but it's actually almost worse if someone else is employed near you, because it kind of reminds you of what you don't, of the dishonour, the fact that he feels himself dishonoured and a failure. It's almost easier in a way to become a statistic than it is to compare yourself to other people. And I think that's a very valid point even today. In some ways it's easier if everyone else around you is the same. You know.
I was watching South Park last night, and like this does link in.
So you do watch television, you see? You said you don't watch television, and you do. You watch South Park.
Oh, my boyfriend made me watch.
Ah, of course he did. Yeah.
Like as soon as this man was like sort of labelled as an alcoholic, he accepted it.
Yeah.
So I think because they're in the 250,000, then they're like more likely to accept it because
Yeah.
they know that people.
Yeah.
But it's kind of interesting because I want to talk about this part of it, because like when you look at the idea of like 250,000 people, but it's kind of taking it down to actual individual feeling. Like,
Yes.
even though when you're in a group, you're supposed to feel like a unit, you're supposed to feel like a support, but regardless of that, they're like so taken out of this like macho concept, like idea of how a man should be, and I guess it could feel like quite lonely, even though
Yeah.
you know there are other people
Yeah.
in your position. It's still down to individual feeling just what like no self-worth.
Yeah. And I think that loneliness is absolutely true, because I think you're not lonely if you have things to share with people. You know, if you share something in common, but actually the only thing they're sharing in common is that they have nothing in their lives, and so what are they going to talk about? I mean, he talks about the YMCA cocoa drunkard at the top of page 78, that these men have nothing other than sharing these kind of meaningless exchanges and drinking cocoa. And the idea of being drunk on cocoa, I quite like that idea, that it becomes a comfort, but it's something ultimately, it's one of these things that takes you away from your own sense of who you are. I think he talks about unemployment so eloquently. It's very good writing. Whether you agree or disagree with his perspective, I think how he writes about it is exceptional. Okay, let's read a couple more pages, and then we'll discuss the second half of this chapter, which I think is even more interesting. But I think not again, or at least not so often. That is the real point. People are ceasing to kick against the pricks. Kicking against the pricks is kicking against the government, against the authority. After all, even the middle classes, yes, even the bridge clubs in the country towns, are beginning to realise that there is such a thing as unemployment. That, my dear, I don't believe in all this nonsense about unemployment. Why, only last week we wanted a man to weed the garden and we simply couldn't get one. They don't want to work, that's all it is. Which you heard in every decent tea table 5 years ago is growing perceptibly less frequent. It's interesting that the middle classes are beginning to realise that this is a problem. As for the working class themselves, they have gained immensely in economic knowledge. I believe that the daily worker has accomplished a great deal here. Its influence is out of all proportion to its circulation. But in any case, they have had their lesson well rubbed into them, not only because unemployment is so widespread, but because it has lasted so long. When people live on the dole for years at a time, they grow used to it, and drawing on the dole, though it remains unpleasant, ceases to be shameful. Thus the old, independent, workhouse-fearing tradition is undermined, just as the ancient fear of debt is undermined by the hire purchase system. In the back streets of Wigan and Barnsley I saw every kind of privation, but I probably saw much less conscious misery than I should have seen 10 years ago. The people have at any rate grasped that unemployment is the thing they cannot help. It is not only Alf Smith who is out of work now, Bert Jones is out of work as well, and both of them have been out for years. It makes a great deal of difference when things are the same for everybody. That's going, again, linking to what he said before. Remember, you had 10 years, really. You had from the late 1920s through to the from 29, was it? The stock market crash, right the way through to 39, when people began to be unemployed through the war. 10 years of depression. That's a long time for everyone in your neighbourhood to be out of work. So you have whole populations settling down, as it were, to a lifetime on the PAC. And what I think is admirable, perhaps even hopeful, is that they have managed to do it without going spiritually to pieces. A working man does not disintegrate under the strain of poverty as a middle-class person does. Another gross generalisation, I think. Take, for instance, the fact that the working class think nothing of getting married on the dole. It annoys the old ladies of Brighton. He does this quite often. He uses a kind of an archetype. The old ladies of Brighton, that's like kind of archetypical middle-class conservative perspective. It annoys the old ladies in Brighton, but it is proof of their essential good sense. They realise that losing your job does not mean that you cease to be a human being. So that in one way, things in the distressed areas are not so bad as they might be. Life is still fairly normal, more normal than one really has the right to expect. Families are impoverished, but the family system is not broken up. The people are in effect living a reduced version of their former lives. Instead of raging against their destiny, they have made things tolerable by lowering their standards. But they don't necessarily lower their standards by cutting out luxuries and concentrating on necessities. More often it is the other way round. The more natural way, if you come to think of it. Hence the fact that in a decade of unparalleled depression, the consumption of all cheap luxuries has increased. The two things that have probably made the difference are the movies and the mass production of cheap, smart clothes since the war, the First World War. The youth who leaves school at 14 and gets a blind alley job is out of work at 20, probably for life. But for £2.10 on the hire purchase system, he can buy himself a suit, which for a little while and at a little distance looks as though it had been tailored in Savile Row. The girl can look like a fashion plate at even a lower price. You may have 3 halfpence in your pocket and not a prospect in the world, and only the corner of a leaky bedroom to go home to. But if you're new and in your new clothes, you can stand on the street corner, indulging in a private daydream of yourself as Clark Gable or Greta Garbo, both sort of 1930s film stars, which compensates you for a great deal. And even at home, there is generally a cup of tea going, a nice cup of tea. And father, who has been out of work since 1929, is temporarily happy because he has a sure tip for the Césaire Witch. That's a horse race. Trade since the war. Let's pause there for a second.
It's quite interesting because I think it starts talking about identity now.
Yeah, good. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like the impact that unemployment or generally the job market at that time had on your identity.
Yeah.
What you wanted to show to people.
Yeah. Yeah, the way in which your outward appearance affects your inward identity, and that by being able to dress as a movie star, even if actually, and I love the description he says, that from a distance you can look like you're wearing a Savile Row suit. That idea of the first impression of someone, that even though you have no money, you can still look quite good. And that's interesting because now, you probably wouldn't say that, would you? The people, certainly from what I've seen, the people don't have that element of, is that self-respect? If they haven't, that you wouldn't, I don't think you'd see that. That sort of, if you have no money, the most important thing is that you're wearing a nice suit.
Well, no, but it's still like you still see people, I don't know, going into a Primark or whatever and dressing like how they've seen Cheryl Cole do as well, and they feel so much better about themselves. It's like, I swear, as there's like the red lipstick index or something like that, as the economy goes down, women are more likely to buy brightly coloured lipstick
Really? Okay.
Because it just like perks you up.
Oh, right. Oh, so buying things, you know, fake Versace or whatever it is that they sell in Primark. That's sort of the same sort of thing. That you can buy you can buy an identity that seems to suggest that you have more money or more status. Yeah, no, that I can see. That I can see. Good point. Phones as well. That actually mobile phone use is almost more prevalent in working class people than middle class people, or people who are unemployed, because it is something, isn't it? It's like a luxury, something which maybe, I think it comes back to this private daydream of yourself that Zoe picked up on a moment ago. You know, that you can have a private daydream of yourself as having more than you've actually got, and you know, why not?
He did say, like, they'll probably probably be out of job at 20, probably for life. And that's kind of, that idea takes away any form of hope that you have for yourself as a person in the world. So by, like, creating this, like, idea in your head of your, like, forming your identity,
Yeah.
and, like, who you could be and what you might be, is, like, I guess it's comforting some people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it can, you know, if we compare it to contemporary society, could even go, if you look at the X Factor again. I talk about the X Factor because I think it's a really interesting phenomenon. I find the whole thing a bit distasteful now. I used to quite like it, actually. When it first came on, the first few seasons, I actually quite liked it, but now I just find it quite distasteful. But if you think about the number of people that queue up to be auditioned, and they're dreadful, 99.9% of them are dreadful, but it's almost like that, for that one moment you're standing in front of an audience. Exactly.
You're looking at a reflection of, like, past cases, like the winners, and you're like,
That could be me.
5 minutes,
absolutely.
that potential to do absolutely anything.
Yeah. And it's what Andy Warhol said in the 1960s. In the future, everyone will have their 15 minutes of fame. You know, that it's almost like that now people have an expectation that that's something that they're going to be able to be famous. Yes, it's called the gonna be culture, isn't it, rather than the wannabe. It's changed now. It's no longer wannabes, it's gonna be's. That's quite interesting, that it's not that you want to be something, that you are going to be. And it's that moment where their bubble is burst, which is quite telling.
It makes me think of, like, the American dream.
Yes.
That's quite like an American attitude.
Yes, absolutely.
Rather than thinking, oh, this is the worst it could get, thinking about, like, what there is to come, like you as a person, and you have the potential to, like, growth and stuff, which is a major part of what I was going to say as well. Especially with, like, men, like young men, like inner growth of, like, who you are and character and stuff. And, like, typically men are able to do that at work, through work relationships and stuff like that. But by not being able to do that, and to have, like, a form of expression other than just sitting at home, they're not able to kind of create, like, an idea for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the idea of growth, I think, is significant. There is no growth. There's no development. There's no sense of fulfillment. You know, these men are stuck. And if you look back at the beginning, do you remember he talks about how a lot of these men just don't grow up?
Yeah.
That they're childlike. And I think that through not growing up, they remain in this childlike dependent state. And a lot of the criticism of the current welfare state comes out of what they call the nanny state. And a nanny is someone who looks after children. That if you are looked after by the state, you're no longer able to act like an adult. And I think, again, but go back to the X Factor again, you often see adults behaving like children on the X Factor. If they're told that they're rubbish, if they're told that they can't sing, and this is like men and women in their 40s and 50s and 60s acting like small children.
Because of, like, again, like, you want to have growth for yourself, and if you're restricted to not being able to, you can get stressed about it, because that's the only way that you can express the frustration, I guess.
Well, it's like kids at school, isn't it? I mean, I'm sure either you personally or have experienced it throughout your time at school, that kids who are frustrated will act in a certain way because they think that they're right and you don't think that they're right, and they're not going to back down. And it's just that awful thing that happens where things can go out of control. And I see that sometimes with the X Factor. You know, that they're not going to, this person's, and then they end up really shouting at Simon Cowell or whoever it is, to Lisa or...
It's only because they've been told through
Through
the
that.
first rounds of auditions how amazing they are.
Yeah, and I think that's cruel, isn't it?
That's like,
You're amazing.
that's, you have
Yeah,
to
you're
do
amazing.
You have to do like
I think you're
4
amazing.
auditions before you actually have the audition.
Yeah, you're well good.
And all through them.
That's quite good.
You're told like you're amazing, or you're going to go
Yeah.
really far, when you're actually really crap, but they think you're going to be entertaining.
Yeah.
So when
It's
they're
cruel,
actually
isn't it? It's
told
like-
they're rubbish, they're actually really surprised because all the time before, like these producers have been telling them they're really good. It's kind of.
It's like those little children that go on and their parents are like, oh my god, she can sing, and it's just like annoying.
And it's the way.
It's worse than American X Factor, where literally there's like an 11-year-old that was on that TV show, and I can't even imagine like they're making. But then everyone's like children, like they're putting makeup on them and these short dresses.
I know it's distasteful, deeply distasteful. Yeah.
It's so American though. It's like so typical of American culture, and it's disgusting. I can't watch it because it just annoys me so much.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's this sexualization of children. It's disgusting.
And,
I
like,
agree.
it's
Yeah. Anyway,
bad.
back to the book. It does all link together. It does all link together. It's about a dream. It's about pursuing a dream. There is no dream to pursue, I suppose. That's the whole point of this book. There is no dream. These men have no dream to pursue. Okay, let's carry on. So, top of page 82. Let's just read these last couple of paragraphs. Trade since the war has had to adjust itself to meet the demands of underpaid, underfed people, with the result that a luxury is nowadays almost always cheaper than a necessity. That's interesting. And that's the same now. If you go to somewhere like Tesco's, you look at the cost of the really crappy food compared to the good quality food, and the crappy food is always cheaper. So it's now, you know, your multi-pack bars of chocolate are cheaper than the vegetables or a loaf of bread. You know, why that doesn't...
McDonald's is like cheaper than. That's why like quite a few people. I know it sounds really mean, but you know when you watch Jerry and Kyle, you're like, you are ugly. It's because they don't have like enough vitamins.
Yeah, it's true. Well, things like fetal alcohol syndrome is a really big problem. You see the very stunted growth, and we see them in these schools in Cambridge as well as in East inner city London or Birmingham. It's everywhere. That very stunted growth can come from the woman drinking heavily in pregnancy. It has a name.
My friend's little sister she was adopted, and she had like fetal alcohol syndrome, and she was absolutely tiny.
And it's not just stunted growth, but it's also your emotional development, your mental development. Everything is stunted.
You can't really understand process like your brain can't like understand things around it. It's really weird.
I just think it's, you know, I've taught kids, often boys actually, with fetal alcohol syndrome, and I just feel desperately sorry for them, because I think your life is compromised even before you start, and it wasn't your fault, it was your mother's fault because she drank during pregnancy. Anyway, one pair of plain solid shoes costs as much as 2 ultra smart pairs. For the price of 1 square meal, you can get £2 of cheap sweets. You can't get much meat for 3p, but you can get a lot of fish and chips. Milk costs 3p a pint, and even mild beer costs 4p, but aspirins are 7 a penny, and you can wring 40 cups of tea out of a £1/4 packet. And above all, there is gambling, the cheapest of all luxuries. Think about the lottery now, I suppose, as an example, scratch cards. Even people on the verge of starvation can buy a few days' hope, something to live for. I mean, he could be talking about now, couldn't he? I mean, this paragraph could be 21st century. There's no difference at all.
It's like when I find that if I go to Tesco's or something and I only want to buy like one thing, and then if it's on offer, you're like, okay, I'll buy 2. Only because it's cheaper if you buy 2. But that's what was reminding me, because it's like if you buy more, then it's cheaper. It's like that thought of like you said, like why would I have one when I can have more for like the same amount of money? But it's kind of, I don't know, it's weird, because I think what he's saying is that it's in some ways it's easy for people to indulge in like bad things for them when they're like poor, because it costs the same amount of money, and maybe that's like a little bit of happiness in their day. Like
Exactly.
something like a beer.
Exactly. I mean, I think this is the thing that he comes on to now, that why having these little luxuries like a nice cup of tea is something that is comforting, and that when you're poor or when you're hungry or when you've got no hope, actually you need these things to comfort you. You don't want to have your vegetables. What you want to have is a bag of sweets and a cup of tea. So organised gambling has now risen almost to the status of a major industry. Again, it's just like so much like today. Consider, for instance, a phenomenon like the football pools, with a turnover of about £6 million a year, almost all of it from the pockets of working class people. I happened to be in Yorkshire when Hitler reoccupied the Rhineland. Hitler, Locarno, fascism and the threat of war aroused hardly a flicker of interest locally, but the decision of the Football Association to stop publishing their fixtures in advance, this was an attempt to quell the football pools, flung all Yorkshire into a storm of fury. And then there is the queer spectacle of modern electrical science showering miracles upon people with empty bellies. There's your mobile phones again, isn't it? You may shiver all night for lack of bedclothes, but in the morning you can go to the public library and read the news that has been telegraphed for your benefit from San Francisco and Singapore. 20 million people are underfed, but literally everyone in England has access to a radio. Now it's a television or a smartphone. What we have lost in food, we have gained in electricity. Whole sections of the working class who have been plundered of all they really need are being compensated in part by cheap luxuries which mitigate the surface of life. That's what you were saying there about it being comforting. Do you consider all this desirable? This is Orwell's comment now. No, I don't. There's a surprise. But it may be that the psychological adjustment which the working class are visibly making is the best they could make in the circumstances. They have neither turned revolutionary nor lost their self-respect. Merely they have kept their tempers and settled down to make the best of things on a fish and chip standard. The alternative would be God knows what continued agonies of despair, or it might be attempted insurrections, rebellions, which in a strongly governed country like England could only lead to futile massacres and a regime of savage repression. Of course, the post-war development of cheap luxuries has been a very fortunate thing for our rulers. It is quite likely that fish and chips, art silk stockings, tinned salmon, cut-price chocolate, 5 2-ounce bars for sixpence, the movies, the radio, strong tea and the football pools have between them averted revolution. So that goes right back to the idea of bread. That is bread and circuses. That's Marx's bread and circuses. That's nice, tasty things to eat and things to entertain yourself. Therefore, we are sometimes told that the whole thing is an astute manoeuvre by the governing class, a sort of bread and circuses business to hold the unemployed down. What I have seen of our governing class does not convince me that they have that much intelligence. The thing has happened, but by an unconscious process, the quite natural interaction between the manufacturer's need for a market and the need of half-starved people for cheap palliatives. A palliative being what? What does that word mean? If you're given a palliative, something to comfort or ease the pain. Palliative care, for people who are terminally ill, palliative care is just care that keeps you comfortable. It's not going to cure you.
Is it like a hospital?
Exactly right. The hospice offers palliative care. The hospice is not going to cure you. It's just going to ease your pain. And I think that last thing that he said there is really interesting. What comment is Orwell making here about bread and circuses? He seems to be arguing against it in a way. Yeah, it's not fixing anything. But he says that
which mitigate the surface of life. It's like we would say before, it gives like something else for them to concentrate on. Like rather than like hustle people, like rather than have them moan because like they're hungry, just give them some cheap things and then it's like a distraction.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, it's
to give a little bit of meaning to this like life that they have.
absolutely. It's the nice cup of tea that he uses, and this is the real symbol. And I think this is the same now. I don't know about you, but if I'm feeling stressed, cup of tea.
Everything.
It's not a cup of coffee. You know, if I'm feeling like I need a bit of comfort, I wouldn't have a cup of coffee. I'd always go and have a cup of tea, because there's just something quite comforting and reassuring about a nice cup of tea.
It's like hot chocolate. Like I always treat myself to hot chocolate.
Yeah, it's the same sort of thing, isn't it? It's a bit of a pick-me-up, and it's something to do, isn't it? To make the ritual.
It's like a ritual. It's
Absolutely.
diverting your mind from the situation and giving yourself a little bit of comfort in that moment. You know it's still there. It's not like gone.
Absolutely.
It's in the back of your head because you're preoccupying yourself with a ritual that you've created for yourself.
Yeah, it's spot on. And there is something slightly ritualistic, even more so at this time, because there weren't tea bags. It would have been a packet of tea, which you'd put into the pot. You'd warm the pot up first. And so you go through this ritual of making tea, and that becomes part of the thing that, as much as anything, just fills in the time. Just like the football pools do, just like going to the club, this club that YMCA does, or going to see the clergyman giving a boring lecture. All of these things just really fill in the time. But what I think is really interesting is what he says at the end, is that actually the government don't have enough intelligence to be deliberately putting these things in place, deliberately lowering the price of luxury goods. He's saying that it's a natural interaction between the manufacturer's need for a market, the people producing chocolate and sweets and what have you, and the need of half-starved people for something nice to comfort them.
You see, I would disagree with Orwell in that he's like, oh yeah, this is sort of the thing of the working class. If they have these, but everybody, it's not just the work. I don't think it's a working class thing. I think it's a human thing.
Absolutely.
Like I was watching that program, you know, the one about Claridge's.
Yeah, I've been watching that. It's fascinating. So interesting, isn't it?
Angry when they pay so much for. I'm like, I could go to university with that money.
But isn't it interesting?
But anyway, like they were saying that, you know, so for people who have like, you know, a room at Claridge's for the night, they're not like they're going to pay a lot of money for it, but it's going to be the sort of luxury that they don't get at home. And like you get the rooms that come with butlers and stuff. So I think it's also showing that people with money, they strive
Yes.
for a bit of extra luxury.
Yes, absolutely.
As well. And like I would definitely disagree with what he's saying that this is what the working class do. I think it's just what humans do.
Yeah. Yeah, we want comfort, don't we, in our lives? That we want to look for things that are, that give us a sense of safety and security. It goes back to do look at Maslow's hierarchy, MASLOW. Really, I mean, it links so much into so many things that we've looked at, and it's just in itself is quite an interesting thing. That we look for things that give us a sense of safety. It's right at the base of the pyramid. But maybe the more poor you are, and the more hopeless that you are, the more you need these little luxuries. I don't know. Maybe that's something. You know.
So then I suppose, like, I know poor people get bored, like, not being unemployed, but then the rich people, like, if they don't work either and they've just inherited loads of money, like, they must also get bored.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But they still.
I suppose you have more ways of entertaining yourself, but every form of entertainment in the end is probably going to become dull if you've got access to everything.
But I guess also it's a different feeling if you've inherited your money. Like, it's not feeling like you're pathetic and useless because you can't work. It's feeling like you're better because you don't have to work. Like, I think there's a massive difference between being unemployed and not
needing to work.
Not needing to work.
I think, like, well, there maybe there might be a certain amount of guilt. Oh, like, I've inherited all this money and I haven't done anything to earn it. But they still have freedom to do as they want, to work if they wanted to. Whereas, like, these people have absolutely no choice whatsoever. They're literally stuck.
So, like, rich people, they kind of work for charity as well, because they want.
Some, I wouldn't say a lot. I would say more. It's more.
When you look at the when he describes the middle class and the working class, like family unit,
Yeah.
I think that shows the contrast, because I think men become quite passive when, like, they have got this unemployment. They become passive, and, like, generally that's not what men are.
I'm not
So
sure.
I think it's different in terms of family unit.
I think
That's
some.
got a massive impact.
I think
Yeah.
sometimes they try and exert their like male power even more in the family house, and that they feel emasculated
Yes.
outside of it. So
Yeah.
they try and overcompensate for
Yeah.
that. Like, I know I've seen it in like some of my friends when their dads have been out of work.
Yeah.
Like, they've been a lot harsher and a lot more strict and everything, and sometimes really, really horrible, because they want some semblance of control and power. And if they can't have it at home, where else can they have it?
If you do, you want to just look at? Do you want to skim forward now? I mean, we've got 10 minutes left, and I think the description of the coal heaps is interesting in that it follows on from one of the earlier chapters. But actually, when it becomes really interesting is page 106 and the last few pages of chapter 7, because it links into what Zoe and Cher were just saying there about the family unit. Because the comments that Orwell makes are slightly different, but they are very relevant. They very much link into what you're saying. So he says here, take for instance the different attitude towards the family. He's talking here about the difference between the working class and the middle class, the divide, I suppose, between the working class and the middle class. A working class family hangs together. Sorry, it's for those of you who, it's 4 pages before the end, and it begins. Take for instance the different attitude. Chapter 7. Chapter 7, yeah. If you go to the end of chapter 7 and just go back a few pages. So go back a few pages now. And it begins, take for instance is the, got it? Yeah. A working class family hangs together as a middle class one does, but the relationship is far less tyrannical. A working man has not that deadly weight of family prestige hanging around his neck like a millstone. I've pointed out earlier that a middle class person goes utterly to pieces under the influence of poverty, and this is generally due to the behaviour of his family, to the fact that he has scores of relations nagging and badgering him night and day for failing to get on. The fact that the working class know how to combine and the middle class don't is probably due to their different conceptions of family loyalty. So that maybe that links back to what you were saying, Cher, that for people that maybe you know, that if the man is unemployed in a middle class household, that maybe is potentially even worse, because there's that expectation of being in the middle class, and therefore, why on earth are you not working? I don't know.
I was going to say, but a lot of the time, I see in middle class families, like the mother may be more likely to be working.
Yeah.
Whereas in working class families, it is the man's role to provide for his family. I know, like after my dad was made redundant, he had a complete like identity crisis.
Yeah.
Because like he came from a very traditional Indian family, and his role was to
Yeah.
provide for his family, meant to provide the house and the food. And then when like he felt he couldn't do that, he really struggled with.
Yeah. He goes on here, and I think he's very he comes across as being quite negative about the middle classes, and this next thing he says is particularly negative. You cannot have an effective trade union of middle class workers, because in times of strikes, almost every middle class wife would be egging her husband onto blackleg and get the other fellow's job. Blackleg means to break the strike, and to basically get the other, to ignore the strike and get the job. Another working class characteristic, disconcerting at first, is their plain spokenness towards anyone they regard as an equal. If you offer a working man something he doesn't want, he tells you that he doesn't want it. A middle class person would accept it to avoid giving offence. That's true, though, I think. I'm terrible at that. And again, take the working class attitude towards education. How different it is from ours, and how immensely sounder. Working people often have a vague reverence for learning in others, but where education touches their own lives, they see through it and reject it by a healthy instinct. The time was when I used to lament over quite imaginary pictures of lads of 14 dragged protesting from their lessons and set to work at dismal jobs. It seemed to me dreadful that the doom of a job should descend upon anyone at 14. Of course, I know now that there is not one working class boy in 1,000 who does not pine for the day when he will leave school. He wants to be doing real work, not wasting his time on ridiculous rubbish like history and geography. To the working class, the notion of staying at school till you are nearly grown up seems merely contemptible and unmanly. The idea of a great big boy of 18 who ought to be bringing in £1 a week home to his parents, you're listening to this guy, going to school in a ridiculous uniform and even being caned for not doing his lessons. Just fancy a working class boy of 18 allowing himself to be caned. He is a man though the other is still a baby. Quite interesting, isn't it?
I don't know, I really take offence about how the fact he seems to generalise that all working class people have like that rejection and don't want to be in education. Because I'm just like, okay, this is totally anecdotal and therefore flawed, but when I think of the people I know, like my family who have been in similar situations in East London around this time, education was like the most revered thing ever, and like it would be like you'd pray for your child to get that sort of education.
Yeah.
And even now, like when I think about it, like where I'm from, it's like education is the way that you're going to better yourself. Education is how you're going to get out of this stage. So
Surely that's like personal opinion. Like my neighbour, he's like 76, he's wicked, he's a bit homophobic, he's a bit racist, he's awesome. And he basically went to Chesterton and like, oh my god, like well long ago. And basically what happened was if someone wasn't smart, they'd just make them go and like paint like the football things down. Like if you weren't like naturally clever at something, you'd go off and do like help the caretaker.
Yeah.
And be learning how to make things and do things. And like it wasn't about a matter of knowing, it was a matter of survival.
Yeah.
He said as soon as the job was, if the boy like finished school, when he's finished he has to go get a job. That's really practical.
Yeah.
I think that's quite typical of the working class, like have a kind of practical job rather than, because I don't know, I guess it's more suited to them than by like the means that they've had in terms of education.
Yeah, I mean, but I think it is a generalisation in that, you know, I came from a deeply working class background and went to a very, very, you know, my Dad was unemployed for a long time and never had a particularly good job. I went to state school, never had any of that sort of middle class upbringing at all. And yet, you know, I wanted to get an education. Eventually, I did. But so I think I think what he's saying here is I agree with Sharon that I think he's generalising too much. He's saying if you're working class, why would you want to work after the age of 14? Surely you just want to go and get a job. Well, maybe for some people, but for others, actually, you do want to get an education because you do know that you can offer more to the world.
It's like there was a bit, like it was a couple of years ago, and they did like a massive survey, like the BBC did, about like different character traits, and they found that people who were less well off were more likely to be more hardworking. So and so I think that like I agree with what Cher said, that like it's a way of like getting out of here, whereas people who've been brought up like with more luxuries and like aren't gonna like worry so much about it because they're just not gonna know like what it's like not to have so much stuff. So yeah, I think he's been.
But that's a good point that Charlotte's making there, because now it's very different. In the 1930s, you didn't have access to other people's lives. You didn't have access to knowing what it was like to have money. But now, with the advent of television, we have access. You know, we have a window into lives that people now want to emulate. You know, with the media, with music and film. And so people who have no money, and again it goes back again, keeps coming back to X Factor, but it's people who want more because they've seen more. And apparently one of the main reasons why in Japanese culture they have such a problem with mental health at the moment is because until 1945 most of Japan was utterly cut off from the rest of the world, and it's had such a massive, you probably know this, Lisa, from because you do Japanese, don't you? Yeah, it's the Japan have caught up so unbelievably quickly with the West. Exactly, too much information, too much change, and it's had a massively negative impact on what are a race of very, I suppose, introverted but very quiet in themselves, kind of thoughtful people, have now had this access to this media and this wanting and striving and money and materialism, and actually it's too much. What is the name of that whole generation of young men who've just taken themselves to their bedrooms? They've actually got it. There's a Japanese name for this generation of young men, particularly in cities like Tokyo, who are now have opted out of life, and they're living with their parents, and they've locked themselves in their bedrooms, and they live on the internet because they can't deal with the world that's out there. And I think that's really sad.
Did you hear about the parents whose child died because they were too busy on the internet raising a virtual child?
No.
Yeah,
it was a Facebook game, and they left the baby.
They left their real baby.
That's horrendous. That's absolutely shocking, isn't it? How can people do that? Yeah, well, it infantilizes. I think a lot of these internet, the virtual worlds, they infantilize you because it's all about your status and the number of friends you've got and the number of points you score. And
I think everybody in this country has such a massive problem with their own identity. Everybody's really have anxiety about how they're seen and how they actually are.
yeah,
And it's about trying to translate who you feel like you are,
Hi, Charlotte.
being able to translate that
Yeah.
and show people,
Yeah.
at the same time as conforming to what
Yeah.
people want.
So it's like almost like now we seem to have this need to have a tangible proof of our status and our existence, and what the internet does is it enables us to have that status and that kind of visibly can see how many friends, because you know you can't know how many, by talking to me you can't know how many friends I have, but actually online you can see this person has 8 million friends, but they're not friends. You know, to friend someone on Facebook is an utterly meaningless thing, isn't it? Utterly meaningless. Yeah. It's quite interesting. I've had this big journey in the last year and a half, you know, bringing forward the iPads. And although I think they've been fantastic in many ways, I think they take something away. And it's this human interaction that I think we're losing more and more through being... Your iPad's been broken for about a year, sorry. Oh, proper broken now.
No, but when I don't have it, I proper like not having mine.
Do you know what? What's really interesting, the time I was away, this didn't go on at all. This just drained its battery because I didn't need it. And I agree with you, it was quite nice, actually. Sorry, we have been doing Wigan Pier, honestly. It's just we're getting a bit sidetracked now.
I was going to say as well, we were talking about, this is really random, the fetal alcohol syndrome thing. It's because their parent, you haven't got a chance, even before you're born, because you've what your parents give you. It's kind of like this idea of, I don't know, like a life being something just like, oh, it's my baby.
Yeah.
And I think like as soon as you're born, it's kind of like, well, when you're a kid, you're like subjected to like even Disney films. Like if you don't, you fall in love with someone, you spend the rest of your life with them. Like, and you see like people with good jobs and money and consuming things and buying. And it's like it's actually really difficult, like in this day and age, to actually be 100% sane.
I totally agree with you. I think that's a really, I think you now, not that I'm trying to end on a real downer, but you are coming into a world where it is it's a difficult place to live. In many ways, it's an amazing place to live, and you have amazing opportunities. But in many ways, even from when I was your age, I'm sure Charlotte would say the same thing, even though Charlotte's much younger than me, it's a different, it's a different world that you're coming into now. And I think you've got to have your wits about you. And I think you've also got to work harder than I had to work, because I really didn't work hard at school at all.
When this book was written, it wasn't so much about what was on paper, whether you could write, sell yourself on paper. It wasn't about that. It was about being able to just get the job done, especially for the working class people. And I think in some ways, when that lady said, oh, we needed someone to cut our tree and we couldn't find anyone, like they're so used to, like the middle class people have been used to selling themselves and like showing people who they are kind of thing and earn their job. And I think they're like, oh, they're just too lazy, they're just unemployed because they're lazy. It's like this unawareness of the fact that like different classes have different expectations of how to express themselves and how like make connections and working, and I think it highlights that a lot.
Yeah, it does. It does.
It's like that line that was like oh, they don't even want to work, they're like too lazy. And I was just thinking like that, like how many times have we heard that like recently?
Well, you heard it last week. What George Osborne said in his speech was it Osborne? I can't remember. It's one of those idiots, wasn't it? Well, he said that people who go to work resent those people whose bedroom curtains are still closed. I just think that's such a gross generalisation.
This statistic now that it's the highest ever percentage of people that are in work but want to work more hours. So
you will find you are going into a world where, you've heard this time and again, and you're probably bored of hearing it. You are competing against the global marketplace now. It's much harder now than it ever has been before, because you're not just competing with people in your city or your country, you're competing with people across the world. And the way in which the world is so networked now, it means you do have to be that much better. And it's, I know it is stressful and it's a difficult thing to hear, but I think it's important that you hear it now. I'm going to finish there and hand you over to Charlotte, who's going to you're doing part 2 now, are you?
Yeah, we're going to have a look at... I thought we finished lessons 4 and 5.
Oh, right, well...
Is that true or not true?
Because I've got another...
Oh, well,
If people got other classes that like that help with stuff that we can...
if you haven't got another class, I think it would be well worth you staying, because Charlotte's going to look at part 2. If you have got another class, then you can't stay, because you've got another class. That's okay, Al. It's not your fault. I won't blame you. Thank you. Well done. That was very interesting. Good talk. Sorry? I did. because I'm cruel. Well, do you know what? You have to do a non-fiction text. And I looked at all of the non-fiction texts, and actually most of the authors are fairly rubbish. And either they're rubbish or I don't know them. And I studied Wigan Pier and wrote Homage to Catalonia at university, and I just thought this was more relevant. We've had, I don't know, but we've had, to discuss, it's interesting. You see? There we are, you see. No pleasing everybody, is there?